Hello everyone and welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining me today because, well, we are about to untangle one of the most fascinating intersections of ideas you will ever come across. We're going to look really, very deeply into a text that brilliantly collides Lacanian psychoanalysis, game theory, and computer science. I know, it sounds wild, right? But let's dive right into this. We're going to explore exactly what happens when we communicate, how hidden protocols govern our relationships, and why the so-called third element in any interaction absolutely must remain a ghost.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, the ghost versus the embodied third. Second, the prisoner's dilemma as severance. Third, the three prisoners as overcrowding. Fourth, we'll introduce Alice, Bob, and Carol from the world of cryptography. Fifth, we'll examine the many faces of Carol. And finally, number 6, keeping the ghost alive. We're going to progressively build these seemingly disparate concepts into a single, cohesive argument using a really precise dialectical approach.
All right, let's get started with Section 1, the ghost versus the embodied third. We're looking at the very nature of arbitration. To establish our theoretical baseline here, we need to question what actually happens in a seemingly simple two-person conversation. We need to define the third element. Now, for Freud and Lacan, the third element is not an actual person. It's not a judge sitting in a chair, it's not an expert, and it's definitely not an institution summoned between two people. Instead, it's a hypothetical place that functions almost like a ghost within speech. Think about it. When you speak, you aren't just addressing the person sitting across from you. Your speech can be heard, registered, and actually acquire new meaning from another place entirely. This ghost works brilliantly precisely because it is a lacking place. It doesn't need to physically stand on the scene to be effective.
But what happens in actual practice? The source text points out that Freudian Lacanian practice often ruins this by embodying the ghost. Instead of a hypothetical place of lack, we get an embodied third. It's an analyst, a supervisor, or some institution inserted from the outside. Suddenly, the third element becomes a place that knows things, that classifies and arbitrates. The text argues that this shifts analytic discourse into what it calls university discourse. Instead of the subject's own lack of knowledge being put to work, that lack is just loaded onto a supposed expert.
And here is where it becomes truly insidious. Arbitration doesn't always look like a man in a robe banging a gavel. In its most developed, modern form, arbitration is actually distributed to the crowd. We stop saying, "I decided," and start saying things like, "Well, we read it this way," or "clinical experience shows this." The arbitration hides entirely within the construction of we. The text gives us this incredibly powerful quote. One can object to a singular judge, but whoever objects to the common whiteness of we is counted as black, discordant, outside, or resistant. The third element essentially turns into a depersonalized, unarguable chorus.
Moving on to Section 2, Prisoner's Dilemma, the severed channel.
Let's see how this all builds into game theory, examining our first major obstruction to the two-person dialectic, severance. Step by step, the source text deconstructs this really famous scenario. Step 1. Two prisoners are completely separated. They can't see each other's faces, they can't measure each other's hesitations. Step 2. The ghost of the third is totally exercised by a game setter, like an actual warden or prosecutor, who imposes the exact same rigid calculation on both of them. And Step 3. Because of this severance, each party has to establish the other as potentially black, meaning a betrayer, someone in error, just to acquit themselves. The severance completely paralyzes the two-element dialectic because they literally cannot test each other's loyalties.
So, the crucial point here is understanding what is fundamentally lost. In a normal, healthy dialectic, black and white positions, being in error versus being acquitted, are totally reversible. It's just a change of hands. Error is a temporary moment of the relationship. But in the severed channel of the prisoner's dilemma, that flow is entirely destroyed. The silence of communication turns into the silence of trust, which then turns into the silence of isolated decision. The third element here destroys the connection through pure absolute absence.
The text summarizes this beautifully but brutally. What remains is the silence of the interrogation room. Just let that sink in for a moment. In this dilemma, the song of trust is completely cut off. The ghost is thrown out, and literally only silence remains.
Now, Section 3, the three prisoners, obstruction by excess.
If the first dilemma was obstruction by absence, this next puzzle is the exact opposite, excess and overcrowding. This is the scenario of the three prisoners. Okay, Step 1. Three prisoners are wearing hats. They can all see each other's hats, but they cannot see their own. And as it turns out, all three hats are white. Step 2. Each prisoner deduces their hat must be white through process of elimination. They think, well, if mine were black, the others would logically deduce their own hat colors and run to the door. Since no one is running, everyone must be white. Step 3. The protocol essentially forces everyone toward the exact same white conclusion. Now, on the surface, this looks highly democratic, doesn't it? No singular judges giving orders, everyone arrives at the decision seemingly on their own. But the text reveals a dictatorial core hiding right within this setup.
The dictatorial core is exactly this. No one can be black. Blackness exists in the game merely as logical fuel to whiten everyone else. It's kept inside the system as a position that is literally impossible to assume. Arbitration hasn't magically disappeared here, it has just been distributed to the crowd. When a prisoner says, "I am white," they are really joining the collective order of, "We are white." Arbitration is hidden in this multiplied whiteness, in the sum of those reciprocal gazes. There is no single judge left to object to.
And this brilliantly illustrates the synthesis of these two puzzles. They're basically two sides of the exact same repression. In the prisoner's dilemma, severance means the song is cut off by silence. Absence operates. In the three prisoners, overcrowding means the song is turned into a chorus. Excess operates. Both structures exercise the ghost of the third element. One throws it outside entirely, the other pretends to take it inside by making it an inescapable, harmonizing crowd.
Which brings us to Section 4, Alice, Bob, and Carol. Protocol Fantasy.
Here is where the synthesis becomes incredibly cool. We're going to map this perfectly onto our psychoanalytic problem by bringing in our computer science placeholders. In cryptography and network protocol theory, Alice is always the sender, Bob is the receiver, and Carol is the third participant. But the text argues these are not just neutral technical symbols. Their connotations actually carry the fantasy of the protocol. Alice evokes wonderland, falling, absurd rules, trials, and identity slippage. She sends a message but doesn't fully know where it will end up. Bob evokes bobbing, fluctuation, oscillation, basically the surface on which Alice's message returns and echoes. And Carol? Carol evokes a carol, like a religious Christmas hymn, a chorus, a harmonizing, communal melody.
So look at the Alice-Bob pair for a second. The text tells us this is a healthy two-element dialectic between the absurd subject and the fluctuating other. A two-element relationship doesn't have to be some closed, narcissistic, vicious circle. It thrives when there's a reversible black-white movement where error is just a temporary position that can change hands.
The text actually describes this rhythm with pure poetry. It says, Alice falls, Bob fluctuates. Alice sends, Bob carries back. Alice makes mistakes, Bob corrects. Bob is delayed, Alice tries again. This is the living, breathing dialectic of a functioning dyadic relationship. It works beautifully, that is, until the third element is actualized.
Section 5. The Many Faces of Carol, the embodied third. Let's see what happens when the third element stops being a ghost and actually steps onto the scene. Network security threats map incredibly well to the failures of Freudian Lacanian institutions. When Carol acts as an oracle in cryptography, psychoanalytically, she's the institution saying, well, the real clinic is like this, forcefully inserting external reality. As a censor, she blocks messages she labels as resistance or imaginary. As a man in the middle, she intercepts and modifies the subject's speech in the name of interpretation, and as a Sybil attacker or a chorus, she binds entirely different, singular voices to the exact same white song.
The absolutely crucial point is this. When Carol is actualized into a judge, an attacker, or a chorus, the two-element dialectic hits a total blockage. If Carol becomes real, she forces the entire relationship to pass through herself. She takes the raw, crude truth, what the text calls the crude S1, and harmonizes it. She turns conflict into a sanitized hymn that can be communally confirmed, and when that happens, the dialectic dies.
Finally, Section 6, Keeping the Ghost Alive, the Analytic Task. To bring this explainer to its climax, we really have to apply the ultimate lesson of this text to our own protocols. The text challenges us to ask these fundamental questions of literally any system, protocol, or relationship we enter into. Where has trust been placed? From where is attack expected? And most importantly, into which we is arbitration being hidden? You have to ask yourself, are you in an interrogation room of silence, or are you in an overcrowded room being forced to sing the common white song of the chorus?
The analytic task, the major final takeaway here, is that we must be able to suppose thirdness without surrendering Alice's absurd falling and Bob's fluctuating wave to Carol's harmonized hymn. We absolutely need the third element as a concept, as a place of listenability, of a lack of knowledge, of the possibility that meaning might return from elsewhere. But we cannot let that third element actualize and harmonize our necessary living conflicts.
And this brings us to our final provocative thought for today. The third element is never univocal. To keep the dialectic alive, the third must remain a ghost. We have to seriously ask ourselves, how often do we let the chorus silence our own dialectic? How often do we let an embodied authority or the immense pressure of a collective we destroy the reversible black and white movement of our own relationships? The ghost must remain a ghost so that Alice and Bob can continue their dance. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning those protocols.